In the early days of the internet, radical libertarians were scattered, lonely, and faceless. Without direction, they resigned to scour the web, sifting through content providers in a wasteland plagued by YouTube demonetization, Facebook jail, and covert internet censorship. But then, in 2017, the Libertarian Union was formed. Finally, the average Joe libertarian could find a thriving community of independent podcasters and content providers, all in one convenient location. At Libertarian Union, we'll always have the latest news, interviews, discussions, and even movie reviews. With hundreds of episodes and more added all the time, you'll always find something fresh at libertarianunion.com.
Hey everyone, it's Daniel and Robert the Last Nighters, and we are back at it again doing another show for you. This is going to be episode 49, and the Last Nighters is a member of the Launchpad Media, so you can find this show and more other great shows at thelaunchpadmedia.com. The show notes for this will be at lastnighters.com/49. So, Robert, how are you doing?
Oh, I'm doing great, Daniel. Thanks for having me on the show. I'm a big fan.
Well, thank you. I'm a big fan of you and your fine work. We are talking about Action Point, which is not a great movie, not even a good movie, but it's got some good content worthy of discussion. And the listener who suggested it is actually here with us tonight. His name is Bryce. And say hello, Bryce. How are you, sir?
Hey, how are you guys doing? We're
doing well. We're happy to have you here. And this movie has a very interesting and fun premise. I don't know if the execution was all that, but it should give us plenty to talk about tonight.
Yeah, I like what you guys are doing. It's a pretty interesting idea just to review movies and stuff. It's not really from a anarchy perspective.
It seems like a natural fit. I mean, we're now anarchists and we watch movies, and you can't not see it once you flip that switch. So it seemed like we'd have lots of content to talk about.
Yeah, I know for some, the downside is some of the movies I remember watching, like before I became a libertarian, I was just random apolitical. I didn't really care about anything. And now I think about some of the other movies, and it's like, oh, it kind of ruined it now because you see all these things, it's like, oh, that's all wrong. But
oh yeah, definitely. Yeah. It's ruined so many movies for us. But like Robert said, we were watching movies anyway, and we were talking about them and doing movie quotes anyway, at least growing up. And so it just seemed like a natural fit. And then the other bonus, at least from my perspective, is we can have conversations about something instead of between us. Like, we're not having the argument. We're talking about something else. And when we have guests, we're not debating them. We're talking about something. And it's like, I don't know, it just seems like it makes it easier to have a conversation and get the nuance.
Yeah, I can see that working.
Yeah, because you're not defending yourself necessarily. You're talking about this thing that's over here. Takes the pressure off.
Yeah, and it's mostly opinion anyway. I mean, we try to bring, some philosophy to it and some economics to it. But I mean, we're by no means like, expert level on any of this stuff. I mean, we've thought about it a lot, and I've done a fair amount of reading and whatnot. But there's always more to learn.
Yeah, I'm still. I kind of, I don't know. Like, I became a libertarian back probably around 17, or well, I don't know why I said that. About 2007, kind of at the same time as the Ron Paul movement, but not really through the Ron Paul movement. I didn't really discover Ron Paul until like years later.
What got you?
It was kind of a mixture of things, like, between getting screwed over by the government, because I was just kind of apolitical at first, and then I think that one World's Smallest Political Quiz was part of it, and I ended up, the very first time I voted libertarian, I voted for Bob Barr back in the day, which is kind of weird. But yeah, before that, I was kind of, the very first time I voted Democrat because that's what my dad wanted me to vote for. I didn't really care. I guess I kind of had some leftist tendencies, but whatever. But now I'm like constantly reading and listening to podcasts all the time these days. It's like my main hobby, pretty much.
Action Point. You mentioned that it's a bit of a mixed bag, but it's got some pretty libertarianish points in it. And it's essentially a guy who's running a sort of amusement park, but he's fighting regulations and litigiousness, political correctness, and he's all about personal responsibility. But it's kind of wrapped up in a story about nothing with a very flimsy plot. But before we get too much further, I'm going to read the Google information, and then we will kick the show off in earnest. So Action Point came out 2018. It's an adventure/comedy, 1 hour, 25 minutes, 5 out of 10 on the IMDb, 14% Rotten Tomatoes. So I do stand corrected. When we were talking about The Lord of the Rings on the last episode, I thought that it was a 15% Rotten Tomatoes rating. It says 0.5 out of 5 rating on IndieWire.com. So I don't know if they can go any lower than that. However, 82% of Google users like it. So here is the Google summary. DC, and that's the name of the Johnny Knoxville character. DC is the crackpot owner of Action Point, a low-rent, out-of-control amusement park where the rides are designed with minimum safety for maximum fun. Just as his estranged daughter, Boogie, comes to visit, a corporate megapark opens nearby and jeopardizes the future of Action Point. To save his beloved park and his relationship with Boogie, DC and his loony crew of misfits must risk everything to pull out all the stops and save the day. It came out on June 1st, 2018, directed by Tim Kirby, starring the aforementioned Johnny Knoxville and one of his jackass cohorts, Chris Pontius, I believe. Robert, your thoughts on the Google description thus far?
Well, I haven't really followed Johnny Knoxville's career. I remember back in the Jackass days, those were like, what, 2000-ish? When like MTV still was a thing and people would watch MTV and watch Jackass, and they had those, and then they came out with those movies, the Jackass movies. And I want to say that those were just series of skits and sketches where people got hit in the balls and punched in the face and hit by things. And I remember one sketch where a guy had a toy car up his butt. But I don't remember like them trying to make real movies with plots, and it kind of shows with this movie. I don't know if in the 20 years since they just haven't learned about movies and how to make them. And it seems like they're kind of trying to make a movie, but then they're also falling back on that Jackass type humor. And I just don't know. It's like Johnny Knoxville is like a 45, 50-year-old man, or at least he looks it in this movie. And a guy like that just getting hit in the balls. I think it works when there's like a bunch of guys standing around doing dumb stuff and like laughing at each other. But in this movie, when the gags would happen, I was just watching it stone-faced. None of them landed for me.
Yeah, that's a pretty decent summary. And I would definitely agree. Johnny Knoxville looks old in this movie, and not in the like bad grandpa old. He just looks plain old.
Well, when he had the makeup on for part of it when he's playing the grandpa, but then when he played young himself, it was like, well, they didn't really add a whole lot of makeup.
didn't have to spend too much time in the chair on that one.
I don't mean to trash the guy. I mean, good on him. He's, doing his thing, making a lot of money, being famous and whatnot, but years haven't been too kind.
Yeah. He's had some hard living. And I mentioned Bad Grandpa because he actually did do that makeup for 2 other entire movies where he was an old man doing crazy stunts, Jackass style, but as an old man. So it would like really disturb people, or they'd be very surprised by him, doing somewhat active stunt work.
Yeah, and I didn't see those movies, but I assume they were kind of done in like an Ollie G style, where he would dress up as a bad grandpa and then go out into the world with real people reacting to his antics, as opposed to this being a full-on scripted affair.
Right. So it was like that bridge between what they were doing in Jackass, where they were just being jackasses out with real people and doing stunts, to this Bad Grandpa thing where they're sort of trying to fit in a bit of a candid camera type like trickery, like fooling people a little bit, to this Action Point where they're trying to film or trying to fit a movie around some stunt work that, like you said, it's like the pratfalls and the stunts just fall flat. That he just like falls off a ramp, or somebody gets hit in the balls, or somebody falls down, and that's kind of like all that happens. So that part of it I'm not super crazed about. But Bryce, your take on the Google description and what we said so far, and is there anything redeeming from the filmmaking before we dive into the real juicy bits of this thing?
Yeah, overall it was it wasn't really that great of a movie, but I noticed some random points in it that were worth noting. And I remember, like, I grew up in the 90s, so I was into skateboarding and stuff like that. I kind of followed some of the Jackass stuff. I wasn't really a big fan of it, but it was kind of interesting. It was just something different for the time, I guess. But yeah, overall it wasn't really that great of a movie, but
Well, what was the key thing for you that you saw it and you're like, okay, this is a point worth discussing. Like this is why they should do this on the show.
Oh, okay. Well, I noticed I kind of just watched it on a whim. I wanted to see it in theater just because, but I didn't. Then when I actually started watching it on DVD, I kind of noticed there was this guy with his property, and he had to fight all these regulations and stuff. And then I started paying attention more to it, and then some other random things started popping out. It was almost like this, and like For a New Liberty, where the screaming in the theater scenario, it kind of reminded me of like if someone actually made a theater where the point was to scream in the theater. It was kind of some sort of scenario like that.
Right, because that's always given as a limitation on freedom of speech, right, in normie terms. But the real issue is a property issue, right? People have purchased tickets for a performance in somebody's theater who owns it, and the contractual relationship is such that they're there for an event that does not involve somebody yelling fire in the crowded theater or screaming or whatever. And so anything outside of that expectation or that contractual, this is what we're here for, is a property rights violation. And not you can prevent that, or you can stop that, or there are repercussions to it, not limiting that person's freedom of speech, but because they're violating the property and the agreement on being within those premises for being there.
Yeah.
All right, that's just a tangent. I didn't mean to throw you off there. But you were going to say something else.
Yeah, I was just thinking it was like, well, at some point in the movie, they basically boycott their own park for publicity reasons. But they go out and advertise it as the super dangerous thing. It's like, it's like they have their own private property, but they're advertising it as this specific thing that you don't really have to go to if you don't want, but if you do like it, you can go to it and be all chaotic or whatnot. It kind of had this sense of like where it made things look like it was chaotic, like that kind of superficial type of anarchy, but at the same time it kind of made it look like it was still a good thing even though it was chaotic. I thought that was interesting.
Yeah, I agree with you there, and I actually kind of want to dive into this point a little bit, and I'll dish it over to Robert in a moment, but the whole point of them doing the boycott was because a competitor had entered the scene and they were losing business to the competitor. And the competitor was, corporate, backed with a lot more money. They had nicer rides and better equipment, more safety. So they went the opposite direction. They're like, okay, now that we have a competitor on the scene, we need to differentiate our product and be niched, be very different from them, and get the thrill seekers in here. So if they're going to go full safety, we're going to go full, cut loose on the brakes, make everything super dangerous, so we're going to be competitively advantaged compared to them. And the concept of the boycott, and this is the point I want Robert to take off on because I know he's got a 5 or 10 minute rant in him. And the left doesn't seem to have figured this out. But when you boycott something, you give them free advertising, and that's what Johnny Knoxville is banking on in this. He's like, if we get enough attention protesting, that just gives us free publicity. People are going to want to check it out. People are going to be interested in it. You're drawing attention to something that when people generally do these boycotts, they're trying to say, oh, they're doing something bad, therefore this is the reaction. But all it does is prop them up and help them out. Robert, take it away.
It really does. It props them out. And I thought it was a fairly genius point on his behalf to work with what he had. So he didn't have the money for the advertising, but he did have an outrage mob that he can drum up by talking about his park as being a bad thing. Now, the interesting thing about this entire movie for me is, would this kind of place exist? And should a place like this exist? And would it exist in like an Ancapistan type of situation? And the whole time I was watching it, I was like, why aren't there an army of lawyers sitting at the gates of this place? And how could this place exist from the get-go, from the jump? It just wouldn't exist. And there would be a million, accident ambulance chasers just waiting to prey on anybody jumping out of there. But these kinds of, dangerous experiences that are advertised as such, they don't promise any kind of safety. These kind of dangerous experiences exist all over the place. You could go skydiving. They don't promise any kind of security. And they can say, we'll take all the precautions we can, but you could die. Bungee jumping, whitewater rafting, any number of ziplining. All these places, they all require you to sign a waiver. And why Johnny Knoxville didn't require any one of his patrons to sign a waiver was beyond me. That just seemed like a normal thing that everybody would have, and that a normal thing that even a dummy like Johnny Knoxville would come up, at least his character would come up with, or his entire team. I mean, he had a couple of smart people in that group that could have come up with something like that. It seems like a pretty standard thing. But for sure, this is all about, I mean, what really attracted me when it first came on was Johnny Knoxville said something like, we believed in personal responsibility. And when you did something dumb and you hurt yourself, you dusted yourself off and then you bragged about it to your buddies. And that really was like the feeling growing up, I want to say in the 80s. And then I think we've definitely lost that. Whenever kid skins their knee now, it's like, well, whose fault is it? Who can we blame? And it seems like something's been lost in the society that we live in these days.
Yeah, who can we sue? Which is just crazy, And I agree. When I grew up, obviously with you, you were a little bit older, and so I always felt like I was hanging with the cool kids. But I mean, we could run around town anywhere. We could go down to the frog pond. We could walk downtown. We could go all the way out to your cousin's place, a few miles away. And it seems like we were doing that at 12 years old, 14 years old, maybe even younger. I don't think that
as soon as we got bikes.
Yeah, and I don't know if you can even do that anymore. Like when my wife and I first moved out to an island a couple of years ago, we remember driving by and seeing young kids on a bike, like kind of on the highway. And we're like, what are they doing out here? That doesn't seem safe. What's going on here? Why aren't they in school? That kind of a thing. And I don't know. It certainly seems like personal responsibility is sort of coupled with that helicopter parenting type thing, and that people are less willing to kind of take on risks. And I think it's just that evolution towards where we are today with everyone needs safe spaces and milk and cookies and, teddy bears or whatever to be able to handle like speech from people who they disagree with, or they don't even know if they disagree with. They just hear that they're bad and therefore they must be evil.
Yeah, it's also coupled with this idea that, well, it's not an idea, it's the reality that we are kind of in an information overload stage where you hear all this bad news all the time and you think it's a really dangerous world we live in, where in actuality, crime is actually going down. Just it's on a downward slope for a long time now. And it was more dangerous back in the 80s, but you just didn't hear about it. You had the nightly news that you might watch maybe, and there were a few national stories on it. And then they'd go to the local news and there would be 5 or 6 local news stories. But you're not getting news from all over the globe constantly about every terrible thing that's happening. So I think there's this sense that the world is a more dangerous place, even though it's demonstrably not.
Right. And I think social media is another thing that kind of amplifies it, because now any little thing can blow up and become viral. And then it gets on like the national news or propagated out on the web services. Like I get little emails from Yahoo, and I can't believe they're still a thing. But there's always at least 1 or 2 stories that are sort of like something you would have never, ever have heard about 20 years ago. But now because somebody recorded it on their phone and then it got hot on Facebook or whatever, now it's like all of a sudden, sent out to 1 million people. So it is kind of an interesting phenomena. And I wonder if we're not kind of worse off for it, if I'm being honest here. Bryce, do you have any reflection on any of the stuff that we've said so far? Do you want to take us in another direction at all?
Yeah, I mostly agree with what you guys are saying. There's this certain thing about like this idea that something like one little tiny incident can happen, and I think when we're paying attention to it, we kind of realize that it's just that one incident, but on more of like a subconscious level, when the same incident is being repeated over and over and over on all kinds of different platforms or whatnot, it kind of starts eating away at this idea that these things are happening all the time or whatever. But I mean, sometimes we need to just step back and realize, hey, this stuff is not happening all the time. But
right,
yeah, that's for sure. Yeah, I mean, I don't know where you live, and I do know where Daniel lives, but I mean, our neighborhoods are essentially probably as safe as they have been for the past couple decades. It's not like they've all of a sudden got infested with murders and rapists and pedophiles.
That's probably what my neighborhood was founded on, actually. But
okay, sir. I actually thought about you and your kids, and I was like, would Daniel take his kids to a park like this? I don't even know.
Oh, dude, you've seen my backyard. We freaking have a park like this. And all right, so a guy I know 2 summers ago had a slide in the backyard and had a 4-year-old kid who was swimming in a little kiddie pool. And my friend thought that it was a great idea to tell the kid to go up on the slide while they're wet in a bathing suit. And let's just say that the kid shot down the slide like a rocket into the gravel landing zone and had a condition later named blood butt as a result. And that was a pretty unpleasant learning experience. That was an action point in personal experience.
Yeah, I remember having a bunch of stuff like that when I was a kid. I remember when we first got our pond dug out, like it only filled up a little way at first. Me and my friends would come over and we'd get the side of the bank all wet and stuff, and we'd like dive over the rocks and down the mud into the pond. We'd do all kinds of weird, crazy stuff.
Oh yeah. That reminds me, Robert, when we were growing up, there was somebody lived like 2 or 3 houses up the hill from you, and they had their house and then a driveway and then a hedge going down a slope, and then they had like this lower yard, and we would run from their front yard through the driveway and jump over the hedge, down the hill, and land in the grass below. And I haven't seen it in, probably 20 years, but I wonder how big that hedge is now and how big of a hill that was that we were jumping down, because now that I remember it, I'm like, holy crap, I'm surprised we didn't break our arms or our legs or something.
Well, I remember I did. Yeah, I broke my finger one time doing something very similar like that, but I don't remember what exactly you're talking about at all. The funny things about what we remember, what we don't when we were kids. But let's talk about the movie just a little bit on this movie podcast about a movie.
Oh, we should probably do that, yeah.
So I'm wondering, because Johnny Knoxville, he seemed like about the worst father, even though he was like kind of cool and he had this interesting entrepreneurial endeavor. But then he's like, oh, we don't have lumber and we can't afford it. So what are we going to do? Oh, I know. I'm going to take my daughter that I only have with me every once in a while for the summer, and we're going to go break into our rivals and rob the place. What kind of father of the year are you going for, Johnny? You're the hero of the story, and you're B&E with your whole crew and your daughter. And I'm like, this is the hero of the movie?
Well, don't forget the dog.
What lesson are you teaching? Oh, and then the dog, too. He brings the whole show. Talk about taking dumb risks, not only being immoral and stealing from people.
Yeah, that was one of the kind of bad things about the movie. It's definitely no Rothbardian anarchy, but there's a lot of dirty play back and forth between the two companies, I guess.
Yeah, somewhat. But I thought that when it first started, like he was going to break in and something bad was going to happen, and he was going to learn his lesson, and it would be a good teaching moment for his daughter. But there were zero consequences. They just escape, run away, and then they're like, oh, consequence-free theft. Who cares? Yeah. Don't learn any lessons. No character progression. Nothing. And then just they get away with it, and then we move on, and we never talk about it again.
I think the whole point of that scene was to move the plot along. And even though you probably don't even notice it, but this is when he learns that Dickface or whatever, the villain in this, is trying to sell Action Point out beneath him to a developer. And so it just so happens that this guy is at the place he's stealing the lumber from, and he just so happens to be having this conversation at the time that they're in the same, building or whatever. And it's one of those things that, like, it's in there because they're trying to move the movie along. They're trying to give you the plot points and, tell the story a little bit. But it's so, like, poorly done that I don't think it even works. Like, you have to really be looking for, okay, why did they have this scene in here? And as we do this show, I mean, that's kind of what I do now, right? With every scene, I'm like, okay, why are they doing this? Why is this here? What's it telling us? How is this advancing the story?
Right. And it was strictly to find out that information that they were selling the park, or he's trying to sell the park.
Right. Which is like the most ham-fisted way of conveying that information to the audience I can imagine, right?
Well, and you're turning your hero into a villain. If anybody has any morals, they're watching the movie and they're like, what are my protagonists doing? Having consequence-free theft, and we're supposed to like go along on this kind of like heisty type feel, and like we're supposed to support these characters and feel good about them doing this. Yeah, I didn't feel good about it at all.
And that was another thing. I felt like we were supposed to like get to know his motley gang and like them or whatever, but I kept waiting for that connection with them as a viewer, and it never came. But it felt like they were trying to play as if that connection had already been established. So they were like trying to get the payoffs without getting the character development kind of built in the front end.
Right. Yeah, I would agree with that. I mean, we do get the his cohort, his whatever guy. I don't know, the guy that likes to dress up in tight clothing. I don't know what his name is.
Oh, Pontius, Chris Pontius.
So I think we get a little bit with him, and he kind of endears us to the audience, but only through, some character moments. But the rest of them are fairly cardboardy, cut out type. We don't get a whole lot of time with any of them. In fact, all the characters are fairly flat. We don't really get a lot of time. They don't really make any interesting decisions. They're just kind of flat, bad people with no development. But, it seemed like all those movies back from the 90s and early aughts that were the Saturday Night Live movies that were like a sketch turned into a movie. Like, what can we turn this entire idea around into an entire movie, and we'll build it around this. And they end up being very, one note kind of movies.
About 85 minutes too long.
Yeah.
All right. So there was one thing that he said, and he actually catches himself on it. I actually wrote the note down, and then he says, I probably shouldn't have said that. When he says honest Injun, I wrote that down. And then he called himself, I probably can't say that now. And it feels like that was like him as a movie maker, as a an actor saying, you know what, I realized that I can't do the things I could do 5-10 years ago because people get outraged so easily. So I'm going to say this, and then I'm immediately going to walk it back and like diffuse it by saying, oh, I probably can't say that now. So it's sort of like they can't get mad at him now. They can't like dox him or.
Right. No, he hung a lantern on it. He did a thing, and then he immediately called attention to it and diffused it.
Right.
And yeah.
Because I saw in the news, I don't know if this was today or yesterday, I guess Kevin Hart had been the presenter host at the Oscars the last year or two, or was going to be this year. I haven't watched the Oscars in 20 years, and we do a movie show. Weird. Anyway, I guess he had made some homophobic jokes on Twitter 10 years ago, 5 years ago, whatever. People got outraged. And so he tweeted an apology and said, I'm going to step down from being the Oscar host. And honestly, I mean, no one has a clean closet. You know what I mean? Like, everyone has done something that is going to have offended somebody at some point. And so we're almost at that point now where nobody can do anything ever in the future because of their past.
Yeah, it's the outrage mob taken to its extreme. I mean, it's actually, it's social control, which I'm a big fan of, taken to the nth degree. I mean, I think that social control maintains and is responsible for, preventing 99% of all crime.
Yeah, but you mean market forces type, and probably, I mean, I'm having difficulty with it because the people on the left do this, but I don't feel like it's
well, they strip the context from everything.
Right, but they do this thing like spontaneously almost, but also in unison, and they're calling for government action, or generally speaking, or more government or whatever. But in a way, it is a bit of a market force, right? And it's almost like, I'm kind of searching here, but the mob is kind of full of the worst traits of the individuals comprised in the mob.
Right.
So
the mob is denominator.
Yeah. So the mob is dumb, right? The mob doesn't do necessarily like good things. And so even if it's a market, they're collectivizing and they're doing something awful, even though it is sort of on that same plane as social ostracism and what we would consider a market force in a voluntary society.
Yeah, it's very interesting. So you have, like you said, a mob mentality. So if you were to speak to each one of those people individually and rationally discuss what you said on Twitter 10 years ago and explained or whatever, I'm sure they'd be perfectly fine or even willing to interact with you or whatever. But when you break everything down into little tiny sound bites and you strip all context and all there is just outrage, that's all you're going to get. You don't get the nuance. There's just no nuance on the internet. And I don't know if the internet needs to evolve to a point where there's way more nuance. But when you strip the nuance, all people are left with is this idea that, oh, so-and-so said this thing that offends me, therefore that person's just a terrible human being. And you just assume the worst. At least it seems like the outrage mob left seems to assume the worst. Because once you associate like the random person that says a thing you were offended by with like Nazis, like the worst human beings in history, you're eliminating all nuance. I mean, clearly that person is not a Nazi. But if you're equating the Republican right with Nazis, it's like you've gone away from all rational discussion and you're just have an on-off switch of good or bad. It's like a child.
Yeah, Magic Land has lost its magic, man.
Yeah, I think there's like, it's almost like we're in an awkward stage right now where people aren't really adapting to the changes around them at the right speed, I guess. Maybe, I don't know.
Yeah,
Like all that.
technology is really rapidly accelerating.
Yeah.
And we are just smart monkeys trying to make sense of it all.
Yeah.
I'm offended by that, Robert.
Good.
That lumped with there's plenty of misinformation and stuff. It kind of just confuses everything.
Well, yeah, I mean, all government schooling is misinformation, and most media, entertainment, news information, most of that's all misinformation. I mean, you get it just propagated into you or propagandized into you day and night. And I've had this theory for a long time that people in general have a sense that something's not right in the world, that they can't put their finger on it generally. And I think because it's because of what they've been told doesn't jive with how things actually are. It's that Orwellian doublespeak. Like anytime the government does something, it's called something else, even though the same action, if you or I would have done it, is theft or violence or whatever. So people see the actions, and even though they're a step or two removed from it, they hear the language of what it's described and how it's like responsible for the good of goodness and society itself. And there's a disconnect there. And I think that is part of like the blue pill, if you will, of people who don't see it for what it is. They have that sense that something's not right, but they're told over and over and over again that this is how it works and everything's fine. And that this isn't actually violence. This is the government doing something. Oh, that isn't theft. That's the government making you pay your fair share for the roads and the libraries and the schools and the fire department and all that. So I don't know. I just kind of had this idea that without that, that people would have less of this, like, something's not quite right, that they, like I said, can't put their finger on.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. There's, I forgot what I was going to say.
Well, this place is a lawless, reckless free-for-all. So there's one other note I had in here that was kind of interesting. This will bring up another personal story. But when Boogie, is that what he calls her, Boogie, his daughter, comes to the house that first night, and he says, so there's some hairspray in there, but don't mix it up with the bear spray that's right next to it. And I was like, okay, clearly a bad situation to have those things next to each other. But another personal story is that some friends of mine who we're not super close anymore, and this is one of the reasons why, had us over, and my daughter was, I think, 3 years old at the time, and she loves flashlights. Like, we've got a bunch of flashlights around here, and she likes to play with the flashlights, whatever they do dark, stormy night, the two girls now. Anyway, so there's this flashlight that my daughter sees, and she asks the person who owns the house, hey, can I play with your flashlight? I like flashlights. And the person says, yes, sure, play with the flashlight. And so hands the flashlight to a 3-year-old. My wife's there like, oh, that's flashlight, whatever. And then she notices, like a minute or so into this daughter playing with it, that it is not just a flashlight. It is a taser flashlight. Now, that the whole hairspray, bear spray thing, that just reminded me of that situation because, here's this person, a kid asks for this thing, and it's your thing. You know it's a weapon, right? You know it's a taser. Here you go. I mean, come on, seriously?
Yeah, especially with kids. I mean, you gotta explain stuff and whatnot. Definitely want to protect them from harm or anything like that. But
yeah, and I mean, it's a taser meant to like take down a full-grown man. So what's it going to do with a 3-year-old?
Yeah.
Anyway, Robert, you got any commentary on your side regarding the movie or anything that we've talked about so far?
I've got thoughts, Daniel. Thank you for asking me. So I was curious. This place kind of seemed like it was a hangout for teenagers, but some younger kids also. And it's not like Johnny Knoxville was promising any kind of a, safety thing. I don't know if he had like warnings posted up in front of his rides or anything like that.
The rides themselves were warnings.
Yeah, it's like, look at it. Look at it. Look at this thing. It's held together with duct tape. Come on.
It reminds me of when we go to the fair in our local town every summer. Those things are rickety as shit, man.
Right. It's like you're taking your life into your own hands when you go on board one of these things. That's what makes it so exciting. So I was curious what you thought, because children aren't quite fully owned adults yet, and their kind of rights are kind of like held in escrow, and you're kind of in charge of them as a parent. So do you think that the parents who are letting their kids go to this place and potentially get hurt, and if they do get hurt, you think the parents bear some responsibility in this, or is this all on Johnny Knoxville, the property owner?
Wow, way to circle back on my initial comments about
you better believe it.
The helicoptering and how when we were kids we could run around and do anything we wanted pretty much. And my mom wasn't like the most responsible parent in the world, but looking back on it, I don't think it was that bad. And similar with your dad, I mean, we could have gone and done anything we wanted, right? Like if there was a park like this, we could have gone to it.
We could have. It was hands-off parenting style. We pretty much kind of raised ourselves, but there was some parenting involved, and they kept a roof over our heads and fed us and that sort of thing. But yeah, we were kind of just like wild children.
Yeah, but I think you bring up a good point in that it is sort of the parents' responsibility to shepherd or steward their children or their offspring or whoever they're responsible for. And I know the positive obligations thing is like kind of this tenuous area, but until you're like fully grown, and that's different for everybody, right? I mean, some people could be more mentally developed at 15 than a 25-year-old, so yeah, I don't really have a good answer. I think that Johnny Knoxville, he probably could have done more to be safer, of course.
But the whole point of the place was to not be safe. That was so fun about it. Come here and possibly kill yourself, but you might have a blast doing it. Just like, going rock climbing or bungee jumping or parachuting or, any of these other like significantly dangerous things that are potentially lethal.
Yeah, and I guess you'd apply similar, market forces against that. Like in a voluntary society, would somebody who owns the rock that someone would rock climb on, because everything would be privatized, right? Everything would be owned.
Right.
Would they let a 10-year-old climb it?
Yeah, would they? The parent would have to sign for them, I would assume, at least. Or would they just say, no, I'm sorry, the liability's too great, can't do it? I don't know.
Yeah. Another thing is a lot of the people going, or the parents themselves, could have sent their kids with safety stuff. If they needed like knee pads or helmet and stuff. They didn't really have anything like that in the movie, but I mean, there's a variety of different ways you could have went around to be safe and still do dangerous things or whatever.
Yeah, definitely. They could have worn a football outfit before they got on that sled thing, where they cut the brakes on that sled thing and they all fell off. Yeah, they could have done that.
Yeah, so I want to take us into a slightly different area, and that is when the state comes in to shut them down. They use the antiquatedness of the regulations and the laws themselves to defeat those same laws. So like one of them was, you don't have a permit for this petting zoo. So they get this bear in there. And so now it's no longer a petting zoo. Now it's a protected species habitat or something like that. And then there was another one where, I don't know if it was like a roller coaster type thing or a slide. And there were regulations pertaining to the slide. But if he did this loop-de-loop, which wasn't in the regulation, then he could get around that. And I thought that was pretty clever of him. And it just goes to show that like law is always trying to, or it's not even like law, it's like a legality, or
it's always reactionary.
Right. It's always trying to catch up. And then it's a race between, how can you find the loopholes in the breathing room within the market to still be able to do things and still be productive. Yeah.
There's like the regulation part. It was kind of like, give this an example of like a cronyism type thing, because it was mainly the guy from the other park that was using the state regulations to try to close the other guy down so he could take his property or whatever. And eventually, I guess, well, I don't know if we can do spoilers, but
all the time, spoiler.
At the end, they end up actually selling the park, and then there's kind of a trick to it where they sell it and then they just unleash all the kids to just destroy everything, and now the new owner is responsible for all the bad things that happened.
Yeah, Bryce, you bring up a fantastic point. People complain about corporations not being anti-regulation, when in fact they're very, very, very pro-regulation. And we've talked about this in the past on movies like Aviator, where like the big entrenched corporation will lobby for some regulation that where it's a cost that they can easily bear, but that their smaller competition cannot so much easily bear. And it happens all the time. Most of the regulations are written with the idea that, the oil industry, big executives get together and, well, these are the guys that know most about the oil industry, so they should be the ones that write the regulations. And in fact, they end up writing the regulations to hurt their competition.
Right. Use particular processes that they have established and make them the normal or the standard for that particular market. or use equipment and require that equipment be used.
Right.
There was a big thing related to trucking, I think, in California, where one of the state senators had a significant interest in some company that made some part that goes on these trucks that are now required in every truck that drives in California.
Yeah, some regulations are even blatantly anti-small business, where like there will be a regulation that only applies once you hit a certain number of employees. So it's like incentivizing people to stay really small and not grow bigger to compete with the big boys, because they can't take that cost hit once they hit that big part. So that happens a lot. It's good times.
Yeah, no, I want to dig in a little bit before we wind down. We got another 10 or 15 minutes left on the show, and this might eat up most of it. And this is the point that Bryce brought up about the spoiler at the end, where Johnny Knoxville, DC, ends up selling the park to the developer. He finally gives in, but with that twist. Now, for me, I was hoping that Johnny Knoxville would not sign the paper just yet, do whatever he's going to do, and then sign the paper while it's still his property. But no, in the movie, he hems and haws on signing the thing, eventually signs it, and then when it's no longer his property, title is transferred, he signed the document, then he makes the park available to everyone to destroy. Well, it's no longer his property. So he totally violated this other guy's now property, in my estimation. And I felt really let down by that. Johnny Knoxville is no Rothbard. I think, Bryce, you were saying that earlier.
Yeah.
Definitely not. He basically signed the park over, and then he just Antifa'd the joint. Assault, destruction of property, and all the rest. And he really did kind of make a pretty poor move there.
Yeah, for some guy who says he claims to know about personal responsibility, he completely betrays that idea throughout the entire movie. I mean, he's either robbing from the other guy, or like you said, destroying that guy's property, or he's breaking into some broadcast station to switch tapes. He shows no respect for private property. He's a terrible role model. If anybody thinks of this guy as a role model, I don't think that's possible. But as a protagonist that the audience is supposed to get behind, he's constantly doing crap like this that just I can't get behind.
Yeah, I think they tried to like make his whole arc about him and his daughter, and how about him like being the cool dad, but somewhat aloof or in his own little world, focused on the park and kind of being a drunk asshole or jackass.
Right.
And then
he goes to the trip with his daughter.
Yeah, and they bond and connect. But I mean, that just feels really forced, right? Like, and there's like I said earlier, there's no connection to the characters. It's a muddled plot. The story is just kind of barely there. But it's built around like doing these stunt things, but it loses its impact that it had when they were doing Jackass style stunts. You know, when it was Jackass, it was all build up to the stunt. They do the stunt, and you're like, oh my god, they were doing some crazy shit. Here, it's like, okay, weird, confusing storyline, characters I don't care about, and then some guy in the background got hit in the nuts or falls off this embankment or whatever. You know, and you're like, okay, that happened. So, you know, there's like no tension in this thing. There's no consequences. Anyway, Bryce, you got some commentary there?
I guess I kind of agree with what you guys are saying. I mean, that point about destroying the park after it wasn't his anymore, that's kind of a bad play on that. But
and I don't understand why he sold it. Like, was his hand forced at that point? Did he have no other options?
Well, I thought he said the writing was on the wall, right? That he knew it wasn't gonna last forever.
Yeah, I wrote down a quote. Let me see if I find it quick.
Yeah, 'cause there's some like balloon payment on the loan, and so they opened up the park and attracted more people with the commercial. And the numbers guy, the kid, said that they would have enough money to pay off the loan, I think.
Yeah. Towards the end, he says something. Well, when he's in his grandpa form and talking to his granddaughter, she asks him why it closed or whatever, and he just said the park was doomed with the nanny state and helicopter parents. So I just blew it up.
Oh, that's right. Yeah. So the developer guy sent his son in there and said, hey, go down this ride, get injured, and I'll buy you a car. And we'll use that injury to sue the guy for millions of dollars, and that will force him to get shut down. Yeah. Okay, that's what it was. Yeah, so, I mean, the layers of the plot on this thing are like, there's too many layers for what it is, and none of it really makes sense.
Yeah, I don't know. I can appreciate the real stunts and stuff, but the story and stuff is just kind of, boy.
Yeah, I did enjoy the drunk bear. I mean, that was kind of cool.
Oh, yeah. Apparently they had all kinds of problems getting it over there because they built the park in South Africa somewhere. They was trying to find a real park to play it in, but they couldn't find it because it was all too safe and whatnot.
So regulations actually prevented them from being in many of the areas they would have wanted to be in?
Yeah. But,
well, Robert, what do you think we're about that time for the final summary review? I feel like I kind of just did mine a little bit, but I could do a little bit more. If you'd like to go first, then we go to Bryce.
Okay, all right, I can do that. So I don't know who this movie's for. I think this kind of humor, it just reminded me of Idiocracy with guy getting hit in the balls, and it seems like that. Knoxville had his audience back in the 2000s when there was like that group of kids growing up and they were really into that humor. But now it looks like an old man trying to do that, like an old man trying to still be hip and cool, because it's like he's a 45-year-old man or whatever, but he's doing humor that would appeal to like a 15-year-old boy. And it just seems awkward and weird that he hasn't grown up and whatever. But I mean, good on him. He's an old man and he's still making movies and money and whatever. But I didn't laugh once. I didn't, like all the problems we talked about with the plot, the characters were all flat. It was just a big nothing burger of a movie, and I can't give it a positive review. I would give it like a 2.5, and that's being generous because of the discussion that it inspired. I really appreciate the whole concept. I thought the concept was probably the best we probably could have done the whole show just on the concept. Just reading the short description of the movie. But, I'm not upset that I watched it, but I can't recommend it. Maybe just listen to this episode and you'll have gotten everything you need to get out of it.
All right, Bryce, what's your final summary and a score of 1 to 10, decimal point deep, please?
Well, I mean, I was kind of a moderate fan of Johnny Knoxville's older stuff and other similar things that are around that time. I mean, I hung out with all the people that really liked it. I was into skateboarding and all these extreme sports and whatnot. So I gave it a little bit of a better score. I'd probably give it a good solid 4 or so. I mean, it's something about like real stunts with no special effects. Something about that I can really respect. But it's a lot of them that weren't really up to par with some of the other stuff. And if you look past all the vulgarity and other stuff, I mean, it was all right. It was just very mediocre, I thought. I just thought it had these random interesting points in it. I don't know if I'd recommend it. Maybe if you're a super fan of Johnny Knoxville and that type of stuff, you'd probably like it, but that's about all I got.
All right. Well, I'll have another go at it. And our last episode was on The Lord of the Rings, and I gave a pretty favorable rating. Robert gave a favorable rating, and the Anarchist Mom gave it a perfect 10, the first perfect 10 on the show of all time. So I'm tempted to go the opposite direction and give the perfect 0 score, but I won't. I won't actually got through this movie. There have been a few movies in the past that I've started watching and I'm just like, no, this is just so bad, but not to the point where it's like so bad it's good. They were just so bad that I just stopped watching. I actually watched this all the way through. So I'm going to go with like Robert went 2.5. I'm going to one up you 2.6. I like it just a hair more than you. And I think that's mostly for the legacy of Johnny Knoxville. I did actually, in their day, I enjoyed the Jackass stuff, the Jackass movies. I thought those were pretty fun. Granted, I was a younger person myself. And I thought that the Bad Grandpa series, I think there's been 2 of those now. I think it's a decent progression for Johnny Knoxville to have gone that route and be less of the in your face, extreme type bro, humor, and give it a little bit more of a nuance. And I was hoping that they would be able to translate that into something more. And I felt like they missed the mark on this one. I think that they were going for, hey, let's build an actual movie, and then within the movie, throw the stunts in. But the movie plot and the story and the characters, not good. And then the stunts, I'm sorry, but with no build-up and no tension to them, it's just, they kind of just happen, and then they're there, and you're like, okay. So, and so it's kind of unfortunate. But I will say that the premise was very good, and the recommendation by you to have us look at it, watch the movie, and do a show on it, I think was like a 9. I mean, that's like, there's good stuff in here. There's property rights. There's personal responsibility. We got to talk about political culture, litigious society, helicopter parenting, and all the rest, and social media effects, ostracism, and all of those. And those are always interesting things. And we've done movies in the past that have been terrible crap movies that ended up being great discussions, just like this one. So I'm happy that you brought this to us. So thank you very much, Bryce.
Yeah, thanks for having me on.
All right. Well, everyone, this has been the Last Nighters episode 49. You can find the show notes and more at lastnighters.com/49. If you want to support us on Patreon, do that at lastnighters.com/Patreon. And Robert, I think we landed on a movie for next week.
Oh, yeah?
And it's on Netflix, so it's freezies for us. Well, not free, but, it's like included in our pricing package here. The Outlaw King.
Yeah, it's a fairly recent retelling, kind of like Braveheart Part 2. Came out, I think, just a couple of weeks ago. It tells the story of Robert the Bruce post Braveheart and his struggles against the King of England. So check it out. Come back next week. We'll be talking about it.
We will be talking about it. Oh, yes, we will. And so that'll be a lot of fun. And I think that's about it from us over at the Last Nighters Crew. So, Bryce, thank you again for recommending the show and coming on the show, recommending the movie and coming on the show. How's that? That sounds better. So, again, lastnighters.com/49. And I'll say good night from last night, everyone.